In this section, we're going to take a quick look at building a couple of really small React applications. They're not going to be very fancy. They're not going to have a super big model layer or using Redux or Flux or dispatchers or anything like that. We're just going to look at just pure, unadulterated React to kind of get a feeling for how React works, how it fits in, how do we interact with it, how do we get it to do the things we want it to do, and also as to establish some terminology. So I recommend you guys follow along. What I have on the screen here is the React documentation. There is a quick start, a tutorial, some documentation about thinking in React, and so on, as well as a lot of other documentation that will be very, very useful for you as you start using React more. Now, we're going to cover a lot of the things that are covered in this documentation, but I do want to point it out. There is a they didn't have this when I was learning. I guess this is new, but they have some JS fiddles set up for you, so you can jump right in and start playing around with React. But what I want to do instead is I want to go ahead and build these applications just straight up on our system and pull down React and Babel straight into our directory using Bower. So like I said earlier in earlier video, we will be using Node.js, so make sure you have the latest version of Node.js and npm installed. So if I do Node version, I get 6.3.0. If I do npm version, I get 3.10.3. So those are the versions that I'm going to be using. Also, make sure you have Bower installed. Bower is a package manager that we're going to be using simply to pull down the latest version of React and Babel. So to install Bower, you would do npm install -g Bower, and you go ahead and install that. So now you should be able to, once you run that command and it goes through and installs, you should be able to type in Bower. And if you type in Bower, you should get some sort of output, in this case, the usage of the command. If you don't get that, it's possible that your paths are not set up correctly. If you just installed Node and npm on your system, you might need to restart your computer. Or you might have a previous version of npm and Node installed and the pathing isn't correct. So check your environment variables. If after installing Bower with the -g flag, you're not able to type in Bower in a command prompt, that means your path environment variable is not correctly set up. So in order to work with React, we're going to need two things. We're first of all going to need React itself. So I'm going to type in Bower install React and hit enter. And what that'll do is that'll go out to the repository, the actual GitHub repository, and go and install the latest version of React into this newly created Bower components folder. So I'm just working in an empty directory right now, or was working in an empty directory. So inside of Bower components, we have React, and then these are all the builds, the final distributables for the React library. So once we have all that installed, we now need something called Babel. Now, the thing about React is that to use it, we should be using some ES 2015 features that may not be available in old browsers, such as the new ES 2015 class syntax. And if you're not familiar with that, I have a video series called Using Modern JavaScript Today that goes over all the ES 2015 features that you might not be familiar with, and we're going to be taking advantage of all those features. But not all browsers understand it, so we need a intermediary step called Babel to transpile our JavaScript that uses the new features into JavaScript that uses the old features so that it'll work on all your browsers. In addition to those features that we need to be able to use, such as the class and extend syntax, we also are going to be needing something called JSX. And JSX is a language extension to JavaScript. It's not standardized by by ECMA or the TC39. It's a syntax that Facebook made with React, and it kind of allows us to write HTML-like code inside of JavaScript. But obviously, JSX code is not valid JavaScript. So Babel, in addition to letting us use the new features, will also allow us to use JSX. And so yeah, stuff and things. So we've got to make sure we have Babel installed. So I'm going to say Bower install Babel. Now, when we build our big application in this series, we are going to be taking a look at the build steps and properly configuring everything for both development and production scenarios. However, in this video and the next one, what we're going to be doing is using Babel in a way where it will go out and actually transpile our code on the fly. So we don't need to set up any complicated build steps to get going and working with Babel. Now, if we go into Bower components, we now have a Babel folder. And inside of that, we have the browser.js file. And that's the file that we're going to be including into our page that will allow us to transpile our modern JavaScript into JavaScript that'll work everywhere on the fly. Now, I really want to stress this. What we're going to be using Babel, or how we're going to be using Babel, is a thing that you would only use in a development or sort of a playing around sort of scenario. It's not something you'd use for production, but it'll serve our purposes. The next thing that we need is a web server. And so if you have npm and node installed, simply type in npm install -g, the -g is important, live-server. So make sure you have live server installed. And the live server is a fancy little web server that we can run out of any directory on our system very easily. And it'll allow us to test our code as we write it. So I'm going to move this off to the side here, and we're going to look at Visual Studio Code. And I'll bring this up later, but I am using an icon set provided by the extension, which, oh, I have an extension update, don't I? Provided by the extension VS Code Icons. Recently, Visual Studio Code supports icon support, and the VS Code icon template allows us to come in here and say file icon theme, and allows us to select VS Code icons. There's a couple other built-in ones that aren't as fancy, but I really like this one. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to create two files. We're going to create a how about an example1.html file? And we're also going to create an example1.js file. So I'm separating out the JavaScript that we're going to be writing from the HTML that we have. And the reason I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. First of all, Visual Studio Code does not give IntelliSense or code completion for inline JavaScript and HTML yet. One day it will happen. And also because we need the external JavaScript file because Babel is actually going to pre-process this JavaScript file. So let's go ahead and just and get this going. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then we're going to have an HTML head plus body. And I'm using tab to complete that. And then the head, I don't care about the head. In fact, I don't even know why I put it there. Inside the body, we're going to put in a div called application. Now, I'm going to put in h1 here and say example1. And then we have our div with an ID of application. So I think I alluded to this in the previous video, but the idea about React is you have these mount points where the React starts to act on a particular element. And so everything that React does will be confined into one root element, one root mount node. And that's what this div ID application is. So now let's go ahead and include our scripts. Oh, come on, I can't type apparently. We're going to include Bower components. Did I get that right? Yeah, Bower components. And we're first going to include React. We're going to want React and React DOM. So we're going to do script Bower components, react.js, and then we're going to do react-dom.js. So what these are is React is the core React library. It does all the React-y type things, but it doesn't really do anything yet. It just provides the core infrastructure for the React library. The React DOM and the React server are two different ways that we can use to express a React application. So the React DOM, what that'll do is it'll allow React to hook into the DOM and provide a single-page application experience within our JavaScript application. The React DOM server, however, is for server-side rendering. So let's say that we want to have a web page, a single-page application, but we want to have our React code run on the server so that when the HTML is sent to the browser, it's sent as a fully hydrated document object model, as opposed to just, what we see here with this div ID application where it's blank, that gets served to the browser, and then search engines don't know what that means. Well, if you pre-render it on the server, what'll happen is the entire React application gets rendered out into a string sent to the browser, and then the code inside the browser then overtakes those DOM elements. So that's why we have two, React DOM and React DOM server. We include React DOM when working with the DOM, and we include React DOM server if we want to do pre-rendering on the server before we send the HTML to the client. Now I'm going to go ahead and include Babel. So we're going to include Bower components, Babel, babel.min.js, or sorry, they might have changed that name. I think it's browser. Yeah, browser min.js. Actually, I'm going to do browser.js because this is more of a development-y type build. Then, now that we have those three files included, that's all we're going to need for our libraries. But now we have to include our example1.js. So I'm going to do script, and we're going to do example1.js. Now I'm going to do something interesting here. So let's just make sure this works first. So I'm going to alert out A or something, and then I'm going to open up my console window, and I'm just going to type in live-server, and that's going to launch the server. Now, it's important to understand that if you, just like with Bower, if you type in live server and nothing happens, that means you have a pathing issue. That means the path to where the live server file was added is not added to your environment variables or is superseded by another version. So make sure you can do this. If this does not work for you, try restarting your computer, or try changing your paths, making sure your paths point to the right location. Worst comes to worst, uninstall all versions of Node and NPM you have on your system, and then reinstall the latest version, and then restart your computer, and then you should be good. And of course, you have to make sure to install live server with the -g flag, but we already covered that. So what that did is it popped open a Chrome window with my folder. So I have my Bower components, example1.html, and example1.js. If I click on example1.html, we do indeed get our alert, and I'm just going to make sure that all those scripts loaded, that I didn't have any typos. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh on the network tab, switch over to all, and we see that indeed React loaded, React DOM loaded, and the browser.js loaded. So now we have our playground kind of set up. To recap, we need a couple things. We need live server installed, which again you do with npm install -g live server. -g is important, otherwise it'll install it to the local directory. We don't want it. We want it as a global thing. And if the npm install -g might look confusing or you don't really know what's going on, again, I cover all of this in using modern JavaScript today. The second thing we did was we added a couple dependents, or pulled down a couple libraries. We pulled down Babel, and we pulled down React. Babel being the thing that'll transpile our code, React being the thing that we're actually playing with. And then we simply included that into our HTML file. So, the next video, we will actually get going and work with Babel and work with React. And we'll see you guys then.